to this protectionism revision session on quotas, and so we'll be looking through import quotas for this session. Well, we're going to start with what is a quota. Well, let's just think about again what protectionism was. We looked at it in the tariff video, and if you haven't watched that video, watch that one after this. But protectionism is the implementation of barriers to trade such as tariffs, quotas and subsidies. And so a quota is literally just that, it's a barrier to trade, and it is a limit to the amount of imports of a product designed to reduce competition from overseas and protect domestic industry. So it will be an actual quantity that gets put in place that you will allow into your country. It's different to a tariff. A tariff is where we increase tax on imports to make them less competitive when it comes to price, whereas a quota limits the quantity, and we'll see that this will have an effect of pushing up the price as well within our domestic economy. A real life example of that we'll have a look at on the final slide is that the US curbed steel imports from Brazil and Mexico under Donald Trump, and that was done to try and boost protection for the US steelmakers. You'll have seen in my tariff video that Trump put in place a 25% tariff on steel from outside of the US as well, so really ramping up the protectionism there when he was in power. So what would be the stakeholder effects of a quota? It's not too dissimilar to a tariff, so it's nice and easy when it comes to revision for this. First stakeholder we're going to think about is the consumer. The consumer is worse off as they pay a higher price and demand less. They lose consumer surplus. Domestic producers are going to be better off as they can charge a higher price and now sell Q2 instead of Q1, as we'll see on the diagram. Producer surplus increases. Overseas producers, well, they're going to be worse off as the imports shrink from Q4 to Q1 and Q3 to Q2. However, they do gain a quota revenue, also known as a quota rent, though, and so we'll have a look at that on the diagram. The government, this time, they're not going to be directly affected by the imposition of a quota, like a tariff where they gain the tariff revenue. The government don't get a revenue from the quota. They can sell quota licenses, but from our diagram, we're not going to see that they gain anything from it when we're analysing the diagram. But what you could argue in an essay is that they will get more tax revenue as a sort of an effect that happens afterwards, an indirect effect where the businesses that are protected should make more profit because they've been protected, and thus they'll pay more tax, and so the government does indirectly benefit. The domestic income distribution will worsen due to the regressive nature of the quota, because it's going to be charging more within the domestic economy. So it's not so good for low-income families compared to high-income families. And it's inefficient again, like a tariff. The quota is inefficient. Welfare loss is created, as we'll see on the diagram. Okay, so here is our quota diagram. Let's have a look. Always start your protectionist diagrams with an import diagram. So you get down your world price level, you get down the SD curve and the DD curve, and that's going to give you Q1 and Q4, the excess demand over supply being the imports before. So imports before were Q4 minus Q1. We then decide within this country to put in place a quota. So our total supply within the economy is now SD plus Q. So you can see that the SD plus Q curve should then be fitted onto your diagram. And what does this do? Well, it creates this new equilibrium point at G, and we've moved upwards along our demand curve because there's now a limit to the supply within our economy. It's pushed up the price level within our domestic economy to WP plus Q, and so you'll see that demand shrinks from Q4 to Q3, whereas our domestic suppliers are more incentivized to produce at that higher price WP plus Q, and so our domestic supply increases from Q1 to Q2. So how does that then affect everything overall? Well, it's very similar to a tariff diagram. So the domestic producer surplus before was ABC, little triangle at the bottom left, but that increases up to the domestic producer surplus after, which is AIH, it's that larger triangle. The consumer surplus before was JBF, the large triangle, and that then shrinks down to JIG after the quota is put in place. This then leaves us with welfare loss because we've lost C, D, H and G, E, F, the two triangles either side. And so that is gone. That tells us that the quota is inefficient and that Smith and Ricardo would be very grumpy about this. And we then see that the final little area that we haven't talked about is D, H, G, E, which is the quota revenue, also known as the quota rent. Now that doesn't go to the government. That's a common mistake I see students make. It doesn't go to the government. That actually goes to the overseas producer. Okay, and we'll just talk about them now. Before, they were getting a revenue of Q1 to Q4, and then up to F and across to C. So their total revenue box would be Q1, Q4, F, C. However, they lose the two squares, Q1, C, D, Q2, and they lose Q3, E, F, Q4. They lose that completely. So you'd say that the overseas producer is worse off because of the imposition of the quota, because they're obviously losing sales because they're going to sell only the quota licensed amount. But they do gain that quota revenue, D, H, G, E. So you can just qualify a statement a little bit and say, but they do gain a bit of revenue there. Now, if those two boxes they lose are smaller than what they gain, they're actually net gainers, but it's very unlikely. It's more likely they're going to be worse off selling much less into the country. The domestic producer revenue would go from 0 to Q1 up to C and B before, and you can see they're significantly better off because it goes 0, Q2, H, I, that much larger box. So the domestic producer revenue significantly increases, and therefore domestic production by this quota is protected. Very important, as I always say, 20% of your grade at A-level is down to getting your application in, and a really good example for this theory here and for this to show context is that in 2020 President Donald Trump's administration took major steps to curb steel imports from Brazil and Mexico. So this is again another example of Trump and protectionism, because we used that in our tariff diagram. 25% tariff was put in place on Chinese steel. They also put in place a quota on steel coming in from Brazil and Mexico. This was done, it boosted protections for the battered US steelmakers and jobs in the election battleground states of Pennsylvania, Ohio and Michigan. So don't forget, major Trump supporters in those states. So another reason, there's a bit of a political reason for this protectionism. He's trying to protect people to make sure he got votes in those areas. The US Trade Representative's Office said it was reducing Brazil's remaining 2020 quota from 350,000 tonnes down to 60,000 tonnes. So it's a huge drop in percentage terms, where they actually then tried to protect domestic steel. Because what did Trump do? He suggested that, or he didn't suggest, he actually helped domestic house building. And so therefore they're huge users of steel. He was trying to reduce import of steel, get houses to be built and construction industry to thrive, use lots of steel, which would then have to have been made in the US. This had negative knock-on implications though, because as you saw from the diagram, it pushed up the price of steel. And what other major industries are there in America? You've got the weapons manufacturing industry, and you've also got the car manufacturing industry, and then the housing industry. All of those saw rising cost of production because they were using steel, which was costing them more money. Okay, hopefully that's helped. I will leave it there for quotas. The next protectionism we're going to be looking at in the next video is subsidies. Do join me for that one.